Welcome to the 91st episode of the New Ventures podcast. I am your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. Along with my co-host, Professor Jaideep Prabhu, we try and understand the links between climate change and food security in these series of conversations.
Hi, I'm Jaideep Prabhu. I'm a professor of marketing at Cambridge Judge Business School. My area of interest is innovation, particularly frugal innovation, how organizations of all kinds do more and better with less. And through that work, I've become interested in climate change and food security and innovations in that space. I'm delighted to be on this podcast with Sanjoy.
And our guest for today is Dr. Patrick Worms, the Senior Science Policy Advisor for the World Agroforestry Center. Welcome, Patrick.
Thank you, Sanjay. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Patrick, I know that we have something very interesting in common, namely Cambridge University. It would be wonderful to hear a bit about your time at Cambridge, what you studied, what your impressions were, and so on.
Well, I arrived as a young and naive undergraduate, straight off the boat from America, where I'd been for an exchange year. And so the first challenge I had upon arriving in Cambridge is that the accent was very different from the one that was being spoken in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. But I rapidly adapted. I was a natural scientist, and I started off with a focus on physics, but switched to biochemistry, and that got me into molecular genetics, a field I then pursued through a master's at Leeds before joining the European Commission at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then I started becoming involved in environmental affairs and agricultural affairs. And I've been doing that pretty much ever since, with a strong focus on science communications and on the marketing of environmental remediation. One thing that happened to me is back in the 1990s, in the early 90s, we had a big environmental remediation program in Hungary. We changed the legislation, we reformed the ministry, new laboratories, new computers, you name it. We got that ministry ready to join the European Union by operating, at least on paper, to European standards. However, nothing had changed. Nothing whatsoever changed, because the population and the bureaucrats had both been conditioned to live in an environment in which we had two sources of legitimacy: the Constitution and the written law on the one hand, and what the Communist Party wanted on the other. And if you were stupid enough to believe that the first set of legitimacy was more important than the second set of legitimacy, in the worst years, you got a one-way ticket to Siberia. So people just settled and waited. All right, they changed mentally, they changed the imperial capital from Moscow to Brussels. And now, all right, we've done what Brussels wants. We've got our legislation in place. It's everything. And now we're just going to wait and see what we need to do next, right? What they really want us to do. And that got me interested in science communication and I like to use the word propaganda, in order to help people understand what their rights are, to help them understand what their powers are, and to help them understand how they can, through communities, begin to change the circumstances in which they find themselves. And that then, long way around, got me back to Cambridge, because of course once you start doing that, you start getting into debates such as a sparing or sharing debate, which I'm sure you've covered already. And there is some fantastic work being done by Professor Bellment and others at Cambridge. So that occasionally gets me back to my alma mater. Finally, don't tell anyone, but I wasn't a particularly good undergraduate student. I was just enjoying life too much back in those days.
Well, that's great to hear. And what a set of a range of things you've done, going from physics to biochemistry to biology, food, agriculture, policy. Tell us a little bit about how your world evolved. What was your thinking, and how has that shaped your career?
I have that grounding in the science. The first thing that I did with that was to expand my understanding of what that meant from the molecular level to the landscape level, which is messier, more complicated, and thus way more interesting. The second thing that I did was learning from that experience, those years spent working in Central and Eastern Europe and then in the former Soviet Union, was to sharpen my understanding of how society works and how individuals work within society and how beliefs are formed and how behaviors are influenced. With that, I became sufficiently interested in that to actually leave the European Commission, where I worked for 7 years, and join a marketing company. I became head of corporate Europe for Ogilvy Public Relations, which is part of the WPP group. I left that then to found my own lobbying shop here in Brussels, Aspect Consulting. In the end, I stepped away from that and sold my shares back to my partners because there was a bit of a conflict between doing good in the money terms and doing good in the world terms. And that is when I joined World Agroforestry, which I did in 2011. So I've been doing that work, gone back, if you like, to the work of combining science and combining society, now in a purely development context for the last 14 years already.
Tell us a little bit about agroforestry.
Agroforestry simply means that you're being clever about your farming landscape. If you look at a real landscape, it usually has trees in it, a natural landscape or a semi-natural landscape. And if you are in an environment which is subject to periodic droughts, you will no doubt have noticed that the areas with the trees stay greener longer, have a moister climate, seem to have more plants growing in them. Agroforestry uses that phenomenon in the farming context. So it simply means integrating trees or shrubs into your farming system. And it can be in any kind of farming system. It can be in arable farming systems, it can be in rice paddies, it can be in horticulture, it can be in orchard, it can be for grazing livestock. Basically, the limiting factor for agroforestry is rainfall. If it gets too dry, then you're typically in grasslands, and you may have some species that are adapted to these dry conditions. So you will have scattered tree cover, but apart from that, you can do agroforestry almost anywhere. Now, some technology will prevent you from doing that. Pivot irrigation, for example. It's obvious you cannot plant trees when you have that system going on. And that's an issue, because while pivot irrigation works really well in terms of providing irrigation to crops, the lack of trees is damaging the soil and is damaging your farming system. A way to think about that, Jaideep, is if you're a businessman, you're always going to try to drive down your costs and you're going to try to increase your revenues. And one way of driving down your costs is to use processes that are cheaper. And in farming, the cheapest process of all is a process that's given to you for free by nature. So integrating trees gives you free fertilizer, because the leaves of trees, when they fall onto the ground, will rot and release their nutrients. It gives you a free microclimate. You have that distributed shade. It's cheaper than plastic netting. It gives you extra product because you can harvest the nuts or the fruits or the timber or what have you in order to supplement the income you get from your main farming system. And you're protecting yourself to a certain extent against drought, against storms, against floods, and against erosion. And you're doing all that, and all that is being done for you for free by an organism that is capable of finding its own sustenance in the landscape through its roots. So it's not surprising, really, that if you look at the history of farming, almost all farming until modern times was an agroforestry system of one kind or another.
The World Agroforestry Center, the organization is a mouthful, cipher ICRAF. Tell us a little bit about the organization, please.
So CIFOR stands for Center for International Forestry Research, and ICRAF stands for International Center for Research in Agroforestry. And as these two names suggest, they were originally independent institutions, which merged a few years ago. CIFOR is headquartered in Bogor in Indonesia, that's just outside Jakarta, and is specialized in tropical forestry systems. ICRAF is headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya and is specialized in agroforestry systems. Together, these institutions are active in about 50 countries around the tropics and subtropics, with a bit of work sometimes in temperate zone countries like North Korea, where we've done some work. It's a research institution, so we've got about 700 people, and it's an institution that focuses on developing the evidence base to encourage policymakers to adopt agroforestry in their policies so that they in turn can encourage their farmers to adopt agroforestry. In the forestry side, the research is very much focused on how to combine the production of forest commodities, think of palm oil or rubber or coffee or cocoa, with biodiversity, soil conservation, and climate change targets. The clients that we have for that work are always or almost always smallholder farmers. So it's those almost 1 billion people, 1 billion families around the world that are making their living from the land in modest settings, and it's their lives that we try to better. If you want it in one sentence, my job is to give people a good night's sleep. I want these farmers to not be racked with anxiety because of what's happening in their farm. And if they use the techniques that we develop, that level of anxiety is going to go right down.
Obviously, very noble intention. Jaideep and myself have been doing this podcast for a bit of time. And one of the things that has got thrown at us are these words. I really like the way you defined agroforestry, but there are other words: agroecology, regenerative farming, conservation agriculture. Are they kind of different, or are they part of the same continuum?
It's interesting. First, they're obviously part of the same continuum. But second, it's interesting to try to understand why these different words exist. If I give you the word conventional agriculture, Sanjay, what are you thinking of?
Well, industrial agriculture, pesticides, chemicals, dam irrigated land.
You're thinking in terms of a suite of processes, but that word, conventional agriculture, in your understanding, would apply to wheat or rice or cattle or oil palm. It doesn't matter what the crop is, right?
That's the way I'm thinking.
You're thinking completely right. That is exactly what the agrochemical industry or the industrial agricultural complex, if you like, would like you to think. It's a brilliant piece of marketing. They're calling it conventional agriculture or even traditional agriculture when there's absolutely nothing conventional or traditional about it at all. It's a suite of agricultural techniques that were mostly developed after the Second World War that have been scaled up beyond the wildest dreams of their inventors and that have a number of negative externalities that we're all aware of, but it's called conventional agriculture. And you don't use a different word when you're doing it for cattle or when you're doing it for oil palm or when you're doing it for wheat. On the other side of the ledger, you have people like me, the people who do agroforestry or agroecology or regenerative agriculture. What they have in common is that they will always try to harness natural processes to reduce the costs of farming and increase its resilience and productivity. But the main tool that they have to do that is not a magic chemical or a fantastic seed or a new tractor. The main tool that they have to do that is management. It's training. And management and training is labor intensive. Management and training cannot be put in a bag. Management and training is much less subject to economies of scale than fertilizer or pesticides are. And that's why you have these different words, because you have all of these different individuals or small companies that are all desperately trying to get a bit of money to do what they want to do, which is to change agriculture. And the only way they can differentiate themselves in the marketplace is by inventing a new set of words. Personally, my favorite comes from Zimbabwe, and it's called farming God's way. It's brilliant. It works really well. But again, it's much the same thing. Now, beyond that, you have another way of looking at it, and there are differences. Agroforestry means adding trees to the system or adding crops to a forest, right? Or crops or animals, livestock to a forest. Agroecology is something else. Agroecology is broader. Agroecology includes agroforestry, but other techniques that you can use to reduce your need for inputs and your need for capital and increase your resilience and your productivity. And agroecology can apply to things like fish farming, for example, where obviously agroforestry doesn't play much of a role, right? Finally, there is this conflict between sustainable agriculture and regenerative agriculture. I really dislike the word sustainable agriculture, not only because it's undefined, but because it's static. You do something well, to a particular level, you're sustainable, done, you can go to bed. That's not the way the planet works. Regenerative agriculture, however, I like because it's dynamic. Regenerative agriculture is not a target you reach. Regenerative agriculture is a journey you engage on. If every year your farming system improves a little bit, the amount of soil organic matter in your soil rises, for example, or you have more trees, or you have the water table rises in your landscape, or whatever it is, you're not going to rest on your laurels. You're going to continue doing this as you farm year after year, decade after decade. And that's regenerative agriculture. So to me, agroforestry is the description of a particular set of practices, trees in farming systems, and regenerative agriculture is what agroforestry contributes to. Regenerative agriculture is what all of agriculture has to become, and agroforestry can help regenerative agriculture do that wide range of contexts.
So, Patrick, I'm a bit of a novice in this field. You're right in the heart of it, but I'm aware that there is like a big debate between two camps. One camp is very much believes that what we need is regenerative farming. I think people like Al Gore and others support that. But then I also heard there's another camp that says that's not going to feed 9 billion people, especially in the face of climate change. We need to double down on industrial farming. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't believe that these two things are in conflict. You can do regenerative agriculture with genetically modified organisms. I dream of a world in which you have small fertilizer mixing plants scattered across the landscape so that people get their nitrogen from agroecological practices. They get a lot of their phosphate and phosphorus from agroecological practices. But there are some things that are going to be missing, the silicium or the boron or the manganese. And so you go with your soil sample to your fertilizer mixing plant. They mix a powder for you. 1 kilogram per hectare per year is enough. That's what you put down, and that's all that you need. Those techniques are useful. mRNA vaccines, which saved our asses during COVID, are now beginning to be applied to agricultural systems, and it's perfect. Imagine a pesticide that, instead of killing all of the insects in order to reach one particular pest, is targeted on that particular pest and only that particular pest. Done. You have Colorado potato beetle is the first one it's been applied for, and it's fantastic. It gets rid of the Colorado potato beetle and nothing else. And there are no residues. It's not dangerous to any other creature. It's an extraordinary technology. What I hope that we can get to is an understanding that these things are not in opposition. It's not about the hippies on the one hand and the genetic modifiers on the other. It's about them working together. It's understanding how natural processes that you can harness with trees, for example, can benefit farming, but how sometimes you need to add particular technologies to that. It's not about having technologies instead of. Now, the second part of my answer has to do with, to the industrial agriculture guys, the majority of the corn grown in the industrialized world is not there to make food. It's there to either be fed to cars in the form of diesel or to cattle in the form of feed, both of which are an abomination. So if you want to feed the world, it's not a question of improving productivity even further. It's a question of understanding what you're using the production that you already have for. The second part of that answer has to be is we've got to limit our thirst for biomaterials. The European Union has a big biomaterial policy, and they want to replace concrete and steel and God knows what else with biomaterials. And I'm going, whoa, slow down, guys. Even if we increase agricultural productivity a lot, what you're talking about in the end is to harness more of the land for our needs. Biomass, for example, you have abominations like German coal plants burning biomass now to make electricity because those fools shut down their nuclear power plants. And what that does is it degrades the planet further. Not because it has to. It's perfectly possible to do forestry that regenerates the soil or to do farming that regenerates the soil. But because humans are limited creatures, and that includes farmers. That means that most farmers and most foresters will not be brilliant, they will just be average. And to date, at least, average farming and average forestry tends to degrade the landscape rather than regenerate the landscape. So let's be careful about what we do here.
Fascinating. So are there some examples from, say, Africa of where this has worked? And if you had some stories to tell us of success on either side, that would be wonderful.
Absolutely. All sorts of examples. I'll give you one on grazing management in Zambia and another one on cropping in Niger. I'll start with Niger. Niger is either the poorest or the second poorest or the third poorest country on the planet, depending on how you count. It's at the edge of the Sahara. Infrastructure is nil. Education is nil. People operate, let's put it this way, they're trying to move up from misery to poverty, right? And most of them are failing. That landscape suffered from massive famines in the 1970s and 80s. And what that landscape was missing was trees. The trees started coming back, first around the cities of Zinder and Maradi in Niger. The story has it that in Zinder, it was culturally acclimated because the Sultan of Zinder, about 100 years ago, decreed that anybody who cut down a Goa tree, a species known as Phytherbia albida to scientists, would have their hands cut off. So the trees came back in those landscapes. And those particular trees, Phytherbia albida, Goa, they have what we call a reverse phenology. Those landscapes have one rainfall a year, well, one rainfall season a year. It's typically 3 to 4 months long, and after that it's dry and hot. Normal plants will become green when the rains come, and then they desiccate and they dry out when the rains disappear. Phytherbia albida does the exact opposite. It loses its leaves and goes into dormancy when the rains come, and it comes back into leaf when the dry season comes back. It's an acacia, so it's got very small leaves filled with nitrogen. It's a legume, it fixes nitrogen. So you have those leaves falling down onto the soil just at the beginning of the rainy season. And if you crop the soil under those trees, in effect, you're getting free fertilizer. And that's what people are doing. Then you need to extend your growing season, because if you have such short rainy season, even if you're growing sorghum or millet, which are adapted to dry lands, if the rainy season is too short, the plants won't have the time to produce the cereals that you're growing them for, and you'll lose your crop. If you do it under these trees, because they're coming back into leaf during the dry season, they get that distributed shade. Same effect as the netting they're using in southern Spain to grow the vegetables we find in our supermarkets. And so the growing season will be extended. The temperature will be lower, so they won't lose so much water to evapotranspiration. Those two effects on their own massively increase productivity. Now, in Niger, we reckon there's somewhere between 10 and 15 million hectares of these new agroforestry parklands in that landscape. And the productivity in terms of cereals is much higher. You simply haven't had a famine in those lands since. People occasionally get hungry because there's not quite enough, but the idea of bloated-bellied kids dying and vultures picking at them, gone, right? You might then ask why the same thing is not happening in neighboring countries like Chad or Mali or Senegal. The difference is tenure, tree tenure. In Niger, your tree on your land belongs to you. You can do whatever the hell you like with it. You can prune it, you can cut it, you can sell it, you can burn it, or you can grow it. In Senegal, you need paper. You want to prune your tree? You need to write a pruning plan. The pruning plan needs to be signed by the village chief. It then needs to be countersigned by the mayor. In Senegal, a mayor has somewhere between 30 and 90 villages, so it might be several hours away by motorbike taxi, right? Once you have that, you need to find a guy from the forestry department who has to come and look at your tree and confirm that your pruning plan is a valid one. Then, depending on where you are in Senegal, you might have to go to the provincial capital and go to the Ministry of Finance and get a stamp to certify that you do not have to pay the cutting tax, because you sometimes have to pay cutting tax if you're cutting the tree, but not if you're pruning. Armed with all these signatures, you're then allowed to prune your tree, but only in the presence of the forestry guy. He has to come back to make sure that what you're doing respects the pruning plan. Not surprisingly, in that environment, trees struggle to become established because they're trouble for farmers, right? And yes, that means that the productivity that farmers will get from their fields are lower. But these days, you have things like the World Food Programs that's going to feed you if push really comes to shove. So there is a form of social security that wasn't available in the 80s that allows people to make those decisions. So that's the example from Niger. It's fantastic. The other example is from Zambia. Now, Zambia has more rainfall. It's Miombo forest, and it's grasslands. It's still a fair amount of wildlife. But what it has a culture of burning the grass, and massive burning. They burn everything. And that does a number of things. The first thing that it does is it stops the trees from producing fruits or nuts, because the trees have to invest all of their energy into regrowing their leaves that were burned to a crisp instead of growing these reproductive organs. The second thing that it does is it shifts the composition of the grasslands away from palatable species that wildlife and cattle like towards fire-resistant species. And the fire-resistant species are typically less palatable. So you have bare ground between these fire-resistant grass stands. So you have the beginning of desertification. It's absolutely terrible. So what they did in this region called Mpancha, it's in eastern Zambia near Ofunza, is they started putting in place something called high-density holistic grazing. Imagine having 100 cows. You're going to put these cows in an electric fence so that they're jostling against one another. That's the density you're looking for. They have no room to move. You're going to put them into a fresh stand of grass, and you're going to leave them there for maybe 12 hours, maybe 24 hours before you move them on. You move them on when they've eaten about half the grass, no more. What's happened? They've eaten half the grass. The grass seeds were fallen out, fell to the ground because of that jostling. They were pushed into the ground by the hooves of the animals. The manure of the animals was broken up by these hooves. So instead of having a big cow pat that's killing everything under it and whose nitrogen is turning into nitrogen oxide and disappearing into the air, it's been turned into small granules, fertilizer. And the 50% of the grass that you haven't eaten has been pushed down by the hooves and has turned into mulch. So what you have are the little divots made by the hooves with grass seeds inside them, fertilizer, and a mulch on top. Perfect. When the rains come back, boom, the grass just explodes, right? Now, you do that by moving the cattle, not on a predetermined schedule, but by looking at what the grass is doing. You're farming grass. That's what you're most interested in. And when the grass has been eaten, about half, you move them on. Now, you need to adapt this to circumstance. So Zambia right now is going through an extremely severe drought. That means that in order to keep their cattle alive, even in that area, in the full knowledge of what they're doing, they're overgrazing. So there's very little grass left at the end. But you can do that 1 or 2 years without killing the grass plants, and at least you keep your cattle alive. When I visited that place in 2022, I think it was, the last time, I just couldn't believe the difference compared to the rest of Zambia. The trees were filled with fruits and nuts. Water was flowing down the creek all year round. The grass was palatable. The cows had glossy coats and were healthy even in the dry season. Everywhere the maize was doing poorly, except in that one village, because the dairy cattle are being night crawled. They're being put at night on everybody's field in a rotation that people agree. Again, highly densely place. You don't have the grass on top, but you have the same kind of effect of breaking up the manure and working it into the soil. It works absolutely brilliantly. So in the first case, I've given you an example which is mostly about cropping, even though there's animals involved as well. And in the second case, I've given you an example which is mostly about livestock, even though there's some cropping involved as well. In both cases, you have trees that are crucial components to the system. And in both cases, the productivity went through the roof, not because of the addition of a new gizmo or a new chemical or new genetics, but because of the change in the management of those natural resources by the people who are husbanding them.
But there's one difference, right, Patrick? Which is that in the first case, you have a substantial number of acres which have come under that system of cultivation, agroforestry. But in the second case, I almost felt that you were talking about 1 or 2 villages where this is being practiced. There is something to be probed there as well, right?
Absolutely. It's more than 1 or 2 villages. By now, the biggest example is in the Kafue Flats. And there's about 10,000 cattle that are involved. The difference is almost as spectacular. Now it's a floodplain, so you don't have very few trees, but it went from a completely degraded place without any grass to a sea of grass. So, and you have those examples in about 20 different regions in Zambia now. But yes, you're putting your finger on something very important. In the first case, in Niger, all you need to do is tell each individual farmer, this is your tree, you can do whatever you like with it. When you have animals, you need something else, because animals move around. And so you need people to agree on where the cattle are allowed to go and not to go. For example, we've been trying to do this kind of high density grazing in Senegal, and it's absolutely impossible. Because in Senegal, it's impossible to control the animals. And if you don't have a way of keeping the animals off the grass that you've just treated, then you are going to find yourself in a situation where other animals are going to come in and destroy the work that you've done. There's all sorts of variations you can do on this. For example, in Namibia, where I'm starting a project now, you have an issue of bush encroachment. You have that around the world, but it's more visible in Namibia than anywhere else. Bush encroachment is what happens when you let cattle do what they like. You have a big field, you put the cattle on it, and you let them eat what they want. And they behave exactly like you and I would, Sanjay, at a buffet at a conference. We're going to pick what we prefer, and we're going to eat all of that before we go to the second most palatable thing on that. With one difference, the cows will shit on the buffet as well. And so what's happening in that system is that the palatable species over time are becoming degraded. The cows are munching the palatable species, it's growing back, it's very sweet, very tender, very new, the cow is coming straight back, and doing this 3 or 4 times, the plant is dead. And so over time, you move to less and less palatable species. Meanwhile, all of that fertility is still there, and it's being exploited most effectively by things that the cows don't touch, things with thorns or things that are toxic. If your field is big enough, and in Namibia, a farm is about 5,000 hectares, and a camp, as they call their fields, is typically around 500 hectares, you're not going to see that from year to year. You might not even see it from decade to decade. But insensibly, you're going to move to a situation where you have more and more thorny bushes and fewer palatable species, until you end up in the situation that you have in such a large part of the country today, where it's impossible to even move in there. It's just a thicket of thorns, and there's hardly any grass left in between. That means the productivity on livestock has gone right down, the wildlife has gone right down, and the whole place has become a disaster area. Now, in that environment, what you do is you have to get rid of the bush. And you can get rid of the bush using all sorts of techniques, but the best technique involves a bulldozer pulling a steel roller behind it, so they can avoid the trees you want to keep. You move around like this to keep the trees that you want. And that way you get back to a treed savanna, but only if you have enough cattle to maintain the land afterwards. If you don't, the bush is going to come straight back. And so the trick there is to divide the camps into smaller and smaller camps. So the one farmer that I visited last, his camps were now down to about 20 hectares each. Still too big, and he fully knew it, But in that environment, it's just too expensive to pay the labor to move the electric fences around every day or every 2 days. But you get some of the benefits. Not quite as spectacular as when you have a guy moving your cattle every 12 hours, but still pretty spectacular compared to the alternative. But you're right, Sanjay. The difference between the first example and the second example is that because you're managing livestock, you have a lot more issues that are expensive to deal with. You either need fencing, which is really expensive, or you need social fencing, which means everybody agrees to keep the animals off a particular piece of land at a particular time, which demands an enormous amount of time and agreements, which is also expensive and a different way of expense. So it's more difficult with animals, but it works brilliantly when it does work well.
The other thing that I picked up on is the size of the farm. And, I just came back from Zambia last year, working with a bank there and deploying a climate finance project. And one thing I did realize, very sadly, is that banks in Zambia, at least in the couple that I worked with, were now very cautious about investing or lending to smallholder farmers because of the drought that you referred to. But they are okay probably to lend to large commercial farmers. And to a certain extent, I found that interesting because I come from India, where smallholder farmers are far more larger in number. My question is, do you see these agroforestry practices also being followed by these large commercial farms?
Yeah, you see them followed by large commercial farms, provided they don't do pivot irrigation. You have a borehole, and from that borehole, you have a garden hose, but it's a mile long. And it's hanging from a superstructure that is supported by wheels. And it turns around this central borehole to make a huge circle. You can see them on Google Earth. You have these huge circles which are one next to one another. That's pivot irrigation. It's great for irrigation. It's lousy for agroforestry for obvious reasons. You can't have trees because you have this boom with a garden hose that's going to move and that needs room to move. So you can only do it for arable cropping. You can do it for grazing. It's going to be expensive grazing because you need to replace a lot of the stuff you get from a free grazing system in an old growth pasture, if you like, with fertilizer and improved seeds and all the rest of it. It's expensive. It works, but it's expensive.
If you do not have pivot irrigation, you could introduce agroforestry in these large farms as well.
Absolutely, you could. And again, but it's all context relevant. I mean, Zambia is going to have more and more of these droughts, right? That's what the models predict. That means arable cropping is going to be difficult. But I've seen farms in Zambia, large commercial farms that are doing agroforestry in arable cropping systems, but they are trying to improve what they can get from other sources. So I saw one guy who has planted macadamia trees in lines inside his wheat field. So he's getting his macadamia, he's getting some ecosystem services from the trees. No, he cannot do pivot irrigation, but he reckons he's in a high enough rainfall area, so he doesn't need it. Now, whether that will be true in 10 or 20 years' time, only time will tell. But it's an option for a lot of people to do it that way. And pivot irrigation is expensive, especially if all your neighbors are doing it too, because your borehole needs to be deepened. As you suck the water dry, you need to go deeper and deeper and deeper to find the water. Eventually, the water is going to get salty. So you're going to have these problems. You're going to add a lot of salt to your surface. You're going to damage your soil. It's going to get more and more expensive. Pivot irrigation is great if you're the only guy doing it, but because it works, everybody will do it. And so everybody is using the same resource. And so that isn't great in the long term.
Patrick, I don't know if you've seen this, but I just read this open letter this morning from a very large number of Nobel laureates and others calling for a moonshot with food, calling attention to the looming crisis with food security around the world.
Yeah.
And their focus very much is on Africa. At least the press release that I read makes it look like Africa is the epicenter for this challenge. But what's your view on that? I mean, are these issues that you have outlined and some of the success stories you mentioned, do we see those apply elsewhere in other regions? What's your take on that?
Yeah, first, I haven't seen this particular call for the moonshot, but I'm probably familiar with whatever is inside that. The authors are absolutely right to focus on Africa. Africa is agriculturally the least developed continent. It's also the continent with the fastest population growth rate. It's the continent after Australia with the oldest soils, and so the most degraded soils. So it's a continent that needs the most help. But it's the continent where a focus on industrial agriculture is going to deliver the least return. I mean, you have organizations like AGRA, the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, that's been trying to do that for years now, and it's spent billions of dollars on this. And the results, you can't really tell the difference between agro treatment and non-agro treatment. So you kind of look at all that money and you figure, damn it, that only been spent on promoting things like agroforestry and better grazing management, the returns would have been much higher. The difficulties with making that happen are, in my view, mostly about policy than about technology as such. I gave you that example early on in our chat about why it works so well in Niger and why it's got such difficulty happening in Senegal. You have examples like that of counterproductive regulation crisscrossing the continent and making it hard for the people who manage the land to do their job properly. That regulation can have second-order effects. For example, the sheer difficulty of registering a legal business in most of those countries means that there's very, very little businesses to buy up agricultural production or provide cooling services or provide marketing services or to run an effective agricultural marketing board. And so that means that farmers, in the end, are very, very alone. I mean, you want to see what capitalism is like, red in tooth and claw, go to Africa. Every one of these small farmers is operating pretty much on their own. And when things fail, there's nobody to pick up the slack. So yes, it's important, but I would say the most important thing that we can say there is a call to action to African decision makers themselves. Guys, you've got to simplify your regulatory and legislative environment. You've got to give more responsibility to your farmers and to your ranchers and to your nomadic pastoralists. And that's the most difficult thing, because when you speak to the city-educated elites in African cities, the patronizing attitude towards farmers is ferocious, way worse than it is in India or in the West. The idea that you can't trust these yokels, but they don't know what they're doing. I mean, we have to have rules in place because they might do some crazy shit is prevalent. Add to that the fact that the people who understand about farming in African landscapes will tend to have been educated at European or American universities. So temperate zone farming, yeah, they are faculties of tropical agriculture and they learn about tropical agriculture as well. But they operate in an environment in which everybody is used to temperate zone farming. And when they go out for a walk on a Sunday, they see temperate zone farms. So there is a mindset in favor of high capital, large scale industrial agriculture that pervades those conversations. And so you hear time and time again that the smallholders cannot be improved. We have to get them off the land and we have to have large farms. And it's been tried in so many countries, and if I got $1 for every rusting tractor I've seen in Africa, I'd be a millionaire by now.
I wanted to ask you about the Senegal thing. Why do they have those regulations? Is it because of this mindset?
No, it's because Napoleon Bonaparte needed a lot of wood for the Navy to beat the English. And so the French in the empire put in place this regulation that forestry was a strategic resource, and so it demands paperwork. As we all know, the French love their paperwork, but at least in France, it more or less works. But they simply imposed that particular approach, lock, stock, and barrel, to their own colonies, and then it stayed. And then after that, you had a local bureaucracy that grew up around it. It's a bureaucracy. It's like every other bureaucracy. Its first objective is to maintain itself. So working towards its own disappearance by changing the law is not what it's going to do. What happened in Niger is that there was some historical antecedent, the Sultan and his hand-cutting habits. There was the shock of that massive famine in the 80s. And there was the patient work by a number of NGOs, notably World Vision, a guy called Tony Rinaldo, to explain to decision makers that trees are important and to negotiate access to a sandbox. And this, I forget what the size of his sandbox was, but 10 or 20,000 hectares, where in effect the rules were suspended and where people became the owners of their trees. Took a few years for it to work and for people to really believe that they were the owners of their trees and that somebody's not going to come back and fall onto them like a ton of bricks. But eventually that worked, and it expanded from there. And the end result of that was, and I was involved in that process, was that 4 years ago now, Niger actually passed a presidential decree, which is the most beautiful bureaucratic document I've ever seen. The text itself is less than a page long, and it simply says the trees belong to the farmers. No ifs, no buts. They can do whatever the hell they like on it. At the level of the whole country, not at the level of just of Maradi and Zinder. And what you see when you travel around the country, you see the trees coming back.
really extraordinary because you have an example there of needing to have indigenously sort of informed institutions rather than simply borrowing them. But what about the reverse? Are there things that have been done in Africa that other countries could learn, and has that happened?
Well, that's the key example. I mean, agroforestry is now becoming increasingly spoken of in Europe and in the UK. I mean, if you simply do a word analysis on recent agricultural texts coming out of the European Commission and compare them to the text of 10 or 15 years ago, it's stuffed full of agroforestry. And that came out of Africa. The world's first large-scale research institution for agroforestry is World Agroforestry in Nairobi, and it was founded in 1978. The first work that was convincing and in helping the world to transform was done in South Asia and in Africa, mostly with World Agroforestry. You have work done in Andhra Pradesh now, which is involving hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million farmers, using, at the beginning they called it zero-based natural farming. And it's a way of teaching farmers how to use their waste, how to compost them, how to increase microbial life in the soil, how to use the trees, how to make themselves more resilient against droughts and storms and what have you. And all of that is a form, it's agroecology, but it includes trees. So it's an agroecology that has an agroforestry component. So it's spreading around the world. You find that, I mean, even here in Belgium, and Belgium has absurdly fertile soils. You know, we were 12,000 years ago, we had an ice sheet here, and that provided a lot of fertility. So the farming can be really lousy and you can still produce really good food. But even here, you see people are beginning to add trees to their system. People are beginning to use this high density grazing system. That's where I get my beef from, for example. It's spreading, and it came out of the tropics. It's a learning that was first made in Africa.
So in these places where there is a very fertile soil, where there has been more application of, I mean, what I call traditional agriculture, and you corrected me, are there ways, or what are the obstacles for them to convert into agroforestry, agroecology farming?
The biggest obstacle is what Deep started with. You have to feed the world. That's what we tell our farmers. We need to produce more food because we're going to be 10 billion people and they all want sushi. No. When you talk to a farmer, the first thing you have to tell him is, your job is not to feed the world. Your job is to feed your bank account. Full stop. Your job is to be profitable. And you have two ways of increasing your profitability. The first is to try to produce more. But if you're producing a commodity like maize or wheat, you can't differentiate yourself in the marketplace. It is a commodity. It's going to be hard for you to make more money, right? But if you reduce your costs, just look at the cost of diesel, look at the cost of fertilizer, look at the cost of pesticide. If you can cut that by 20, 30, 40, 50%, that's money in the bank. And that's what agroforestry allows you to do. That's what these management systems allow you to do. And that's why farmers start, in the rich world, that's why farmers start using it. Resilience and profit.
Really stunned the way you are describing this. I'm almost feel like believing that farmers are told to reduce their profits because of the noble goal. And then
that's exactly what's happening, right? Picture yourself as a salesperson for Bayer Monsanto. You've got your latest suite of seeds with genetically modified to resist this particular suite of pesticides. You've got an app that tells you when to spray or what to spray or the quantities to spray. And you've got the message that with this, you can feed the world because it's going to increase your productivity. You're going to have 5% more, 10% more productivity per unit of land than you did before. Yes, it's more expensive, but think of that added productivity. That's the language, right? That's what farmers are buying. And that's why farmers are getting ever deeper into debt. I mean, farmers in Europe, they receive subsidies, and despite the subsidies, they're getting into debt. Why? Because it's not the farmers that are using the subsidies, it's industry that's selling them the poisons. And I use the word advisedly. Pesticides are poison, apart from these mRNA pesticides we spoke of a while ago, which are brilliant, which I'm really looking forward to. But chemical pesticides they're poisons. They're things designed, neurotoxins. They're designed to kill organisms. That's what a poison is. It's a definition. That's where the subsidies go to. They go into the very, very deep pockets of these large companies, and they operate in the same way that every dope peddler always does. They spend about half of their money on research and developing, making better products, but the other half is marketing, advertising, telling farmers they have to feed the world, telling politicians that we can't feed the world unless we develop better chemicals and more genetics. We really, I mean, these hippies and their trees, yes, it's okay, but it's not serious. We need our products to feed the world. And when you have that much money, you can afford to do that in beautiful hotels over expensive wine. I mean, it's the way business works. And we get back to this problem that these nature-based solutions like agroforestry do not have these resources at their disposal to influence policymakers in the same way.
This is really extraordinary. I mean, it's fascinating to hear this. Now, going back to agroforestry, what are the types of trees? Because are all trees helpful? Interested to hear your thoughts.
It can be spruce and pine in a silvopastoral system in northern Finland, and you can have a wide variety of dipterocarps in the Western Ghats. I mean, basically, you've got to select the tree to do a job in an agroforestry system. I like to joke with my forestry colleagues and tell them, you guys are silly. I mean, you're planting your tree and then you have to wait 20 or 30 years without making a single dime before you can cut the damn thing down and sell it. At least my trees work for their living, right? In an agroforestry system, a tree has to work for its living, otherwise you get rid of it. But what does working for its living mean? It means it has to provide you with certain ecosystem services, erosion control, distributed shade, fertility, microclimate management. It can provide you with income, fodder, fruit, nuts, honey, firewood, timber. And what you will be looking for are trees that fit the various jobs that you have for them. So, for example, if let's say you're a wheat farmer in Cambridgeshire, then a great option would be apple trees. Because the way that apples are managed is in the off season for wheat. So you can access the field and deal with your trees, prune them and harvest them at the time when the field is not filled with wheat. You're not going to do it with a different species that needs management at a different time of year. So you have to take into account when to manage those trees, what you want those trees to do, and how much time you have on your disposal. There is an old saying that when you're a young farmer, plant some poplars because that'll pay for the wedding of your daughter, and plant some walnuts because that'll pay for your retirement. And those kinds of old folk wisdoms actually have a lot of validity to them. So there is a tree database that we maintain, and it's got thousands of species in there. And you can query it by saying what you want. I want fruit, I want erosion control, I have this kind of soil and that kind of climate. And boom, it'll come out with a number of species that may be suitable to your context. But it's very, very context specific.
What about eucalyptus? Because in India, they were very popular and then they got a bad rap.
Well, they are brilliant at growing really quickly and really straight, which is fantastic if you need timber. And that's why, I mean, in Africa, you see them everywhere. But they are very, very, very thirsty. So don't put them in environments in which water is a limiting factor. On the other hand, if you want to dry out a piece of land, then eucalyptus are great. They also have some allopathic effects. That means that they are toxic to a number of other species, which means they're more difficult to integrate into an agroforestry system. Not impossible, but more difficult. So normally what you do with eucalyptus, you put them in woodlots. You basically have a stand of eucalyptus and then you cut it and you sell the timber. Because it's fast growing, it's something that farmers often do on a piece of their land. But it's not. The thing is, with agroforestry is people glob onto a miracle tree. And then, the world would be fine if only everybody planted this miracle trees. I mean, you have a big one at the moment is Inga from Central America. Yes, it's great, but it doesn't work everywhere, right? Pongamia from India. There's a fantastic Pongamia for cleaning up soils destroyed by mine tailings. And Sanjoy, if you were in Zambia recently, you might have visited some of those projects in northern Zambia. Great, and Pongamia is fantastic, but if you're developing only Pongamia-based systems, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table, right? It's all about the context. It's all about picking the right option for the right context.
And this comment about context, brought me to one thing that I really want to understand a little better. Obviously, you mentioned the importance of policy in the vivid comparison between Senegal and Niger. And you mentioned World Vision, which is an international NGO. What's the importance of local nonprofits, or even today, the local startups ecosystem?
Oh, hugely important. I mean, in India, for example, that whole transformation towards agroecology and agroforestry is all locally led. It's paid for by the state governments or the federal government. It's led by local institutions. Yes, there are sometimes international institutions involved, but they play a minor role. And even in the African Sahel, I mean, if you're working in Mali, first call should be to Sahel Eco, which is a fantastic local NGO in Mali doing their work. But the fact remains that in many environments, you're not going to find an NGO that is capable of doing the work, not because they don't have the technical capacity, but because they don't have the management and the procurement capacity. Getting money from international donors is an art in itself, right? The amount of paperwork required, pitch process, you need to have specialized departments that can do this and are used to doing this, which big NGOs like World Vision or Oxfam do, and a small NGO in Kenya doesn't have. And that's the main problem that we face in that environment. The fact that so much of that work is funded through projects, and a project is 4 or 5 years, then everybody packs up and goes home. And no business could work in that way.
You mentioned trees, of course, and what they could do to improve productivity. And you gave us also a little hint of the role of livestock. But could you say more about how you integrate livestock in farming activities?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it's pretty essential because livestock is a great way of transforming roughage into fertility for your crops. If you are not going to have livestock, you're going to have to get your fertility from somewhere. You can compost plant material or you can buy fertilizer. But in both cases, it's either expensive or suboptimal. If you have animals, you just have a fertilizer factory that's moving on 4 hooves. And when it's outlived its usefulness as a fertilizer factory, you can eat it. I mean, it's just much better than a normal fertilizer factory. So typically, smallholder farmers will integrate livestock almost immediately. And livestock can be from the smallest animal onwards. Bees are a form of livestock. People make honey. You have all sorts of poultry. In Western Africa, you have African land snails, these giant land snails that they do. All of those are forms of livestock you can integrate into your cropping systems. And then very typically, most people will have some goats. If you're richer, you'll have some cows, and you'll have horses or donkeys for work. And you'll manage these animals well or badly, depending on how good you are at understanding how they work. But if you manage them well, they're going to be providing you with services and with nutrition. The nutrition part is super important because rural African diets are pretty monotonous. It's porridge, morning, midday, and evening if you're rich, morning and evening if you're middle income, once a day only if you're poor, but it's always porridge. There's very little nutrition in that. There's very little protein, there's very little micronutrients. And having animal products is absolutely great. Just a few eggs, bit of milk, I mean, it's fantastic, especially for children. So we always recommend that to have animals in the farming system. And the way you manage them so that is, obviously you keep them out of your maize field while the maize is growing. But once the maize has grown, the animals can eat the stover that's left over to their heart's content. So you integrate it that way. For example, you have to protect your maize field from wild animals. So instead of putting a fence around it, you can put a hedge around it of thorny species. As you prune that hedge, those leaves become fodder for animals. Many grazers, like cows, actually like to browse leaves as well because they get a wider variety of nutrition out of it. So you can manage your animals in that way. Again, by mixing things up, by having a more complex system, you're mimicking what a natural ecosystem would do, and you're taking off what you need in terms of services and products from that ecosystem by tweaking it and making it more productive from a human perspective.
And letting my imagination run a little wild, is this possible in the commercial ranches of Brazil, Argentina?
Sure. I mean, I know one ranch in Argentina that does this ultra high density grazing system. So what he's got huge strips that are about 800 meters long and maybe 200 meters wide or 100 meters wide. He has one water line going along the long side with a mobile water trough. And he has an ATV with a drum on which there's an electric fence. The fence just runs across the width of the thing, keeps the animals bunched there. When the animals have eaten what they need to eat there, he puts the second line in, opens the first line, the animals go in there, closes the first line again so the animals don't go back to what they've already eaten. So the management time is minute. It's a couple of minutes per move, and you can do it at a very large scale. Trees, silvopastoralism, is becoming increasingly common in the Cerrado and in Colombia, for example, especially for the production of cattle, simply because of the increased productivity of the grasses you get from the distributed shade and from the browsing, from the pruning of those trees. China, in Henan province, they have millions of hectares of agroforestry systems, mostly in the form of hedges and tree lines in wheat fields. I mean, it's pretty common around the world. In fact, colleagues of mine did a study a while ago, and they found that about 46% of the global agricultural land surface of the planet already had at least 10% tree cover on it. And that figure is growing. So we're not talking about a radical innovation here that's only being done on a few odd farms. It's quite a common way of managing farming systems.
We have come to the end of this really fascinating conversation, and I wanted to just ask you one question. I read your review on LinkedIn of George Monbiot's book, and one thing that I'm personally struggling with a little bit is that you do recognize that, like he does, that the world food system is broken, right? Now, at the same time, I find it difficult to reconcile the fact that, for example, rice, wheat, staple, these production has been growing year after year. I mean, even in a year of the war in 2022, wheat production really grew all over the world. What advice do you have for me to reconcile these sort of contradictory inputs in my head?
One thing that isn't broken is international trade. That's fantastic. It means that if you have a drought somewhere, you can just buy food in. And that's why you have right now we only have famines in war zones. And that's an extraordinary achievement of the food system. Yeah. The fact that we have 8 billion and counting people and that most of them are not going to bed hungry is an extraordinary achievement. It's great. But it's time for the food system to step up to the plate and look at what it's doing badly. There's a number of things it's doing badly. The first is it's not rewarding farmers properly. I mean, farming is the one job that you can do where you can be guaranteed to work 7 days a week for less than the minimum wage. And that's the reality for the vast majority of the world's farmers. That's not good, right? So that's the first issue that you have with it. Second, most farming is pretty bad for the soil. Most farming practices are pretty bad for the soil. Maybe not as bad as the ones that they had 20 years ago, but they're still pretty bad for the soil. The regular tilling, no cover crops, using chemicals, it's not great. And that is something else that needs to be fixed. The third thing is then we need to reintegrate proper management of livestock into a farming system. We know how to do it. We've seen examples of it at scale in Southern Africa, in Australia, in the US, in parts of Europe, in parts of the Sahel. We know how to do that. And doing that will allow you to do something which George and I both want, but which George seems to be incapable of recognizing can be done by humans, which is to regenerate grasslands and savannas so that there's more wildlife in them. I've seen that happen. I've seen degraded landscapes that were restored with cattle, and that as a result now have more kudu, zebra, apple, elephants, what have you on them. And that has to become part of the toolkit as well, using cattle for restoration. So one of the things I'm doing at the moment is talking to conservation organizations. They're beginning to realize that in order to integrate these kinds of management systems into areas that would be considered conservation areas. So recognizing in effect that people like the Maasai were not damaging the landscapes for the wildlife. On the contrary, they were maintaining the landscape for the wildlife using their cattle. So Sanjay, to answer your question, the food system is not broken in the sense that it has to be swept aside and replaced by something else. It is broken in the sense that too much of the money goes to the wrong players, the input players. And they're doing so because they're convincing farmers to focus on the wrong thing, as opposed to focusing on the right thing. And the farmers don't have access to enough independent advice. Agricultural advisory services, like so many other things, were privatized in the 1980s and 1990s. And now we are biting. We realize what a terrible mistake that was. Farmers need independent advice, and right now most of the advice that they get comes from interested parties, input companies of one kind or another. So that's what's broken, but that doesn't mean that you need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And Patrick, you may have just answered this question I was going to ask, but what's your message to the big companies and to the farming community?
But to the farming community, it's easy. Think of your bottom line. Figure out how to reduce your costs. That's the easiest way to increase your bottom line. To the input companies is stop tilting at windmills. Yes, your products can be useful, but don't focus on chemicals. Focus on genetics. mRNA pesticides are the future. Now figure out how to do them for more pests. Yes, better seeds can be part of it, but understand that in environments like Africa, having patented seeds that people cannot trade and cannot keep for the next growing season immiserates people. And frankly, your shareholders need money less than those farmers need money. And that can be done if there is a partnership between the public sector and these companies. And by that, I don't necessarily mean a partnership of equals. I mean, the public sector has to step up to the plate. Governments are the one institution that theoretically at least represent all of the citizens within a jurisdiction, and they have to set the rules. And the rules can be set in the right way. I mean, that's why we have, people complain about health and safety rules, but we live lives that are much healthier and much safer than that of our parents because of those rules. And yes, they can go overboard, like everything they can. But right now, the agrochemical companies are left a little bit too free in what they're allowed to do, especially what they're allowed to tell farmers. And that needs to change.
And if people want to get in touch with you, how should they?
LinkedIn is a great place to find me. My name, Patrick Worms, and worms like the wriggly little things that live in the ground. So look forward to interacting with everybody there.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
Thank you both. It's been an honor and a pleasure.
Thank you, Patrick. Delighted to have this conversation with you.